Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on financing SDG 7. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion on the financing landscape for energy projects in sub-Saharan Africa and the critical role of investments in achieving Sustainable Development Goal 7. My name is Cherop Soy, and I am thrilled to be your moderators for today's important discussion. Let us get to know one another in the meantime. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box and let us know who you are, where you're dialing in from, and more specifically, your expectations from this webinar. But before we dive into today's program, I'd like to share a few housekeeping rules. So first, the session is going to last 60 minutes and it will be recorded for future reference. So we encourage active participation during the Q&A segment. If you have any questions for the panel, please submit them via the chat function down below, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible. So for the sequence of how this webinar is going to take shape is we'll start with a keynote address, followed by a discussion on today's topic with our esteemed panelists, then a question and answer session, and finally wrap up to summarize this discussion. This webinar is the third and final webinar of the series on empowering African youth in the energy transition. So a brief background on our discussion for today. As many of you know, the financial gap in Africa's energy sector is vast. In 2021, our region attracted $32 billion in energy investments, which is far short from the $135 billion that is needed annually to meet its growing energy demands. Moreover, only 3% of global clean energy investments are directed towards Africa, despite the continent accounting for only 17% of the world's population. So today we'll explore the innovative finance models and strategies to bridge this gap and focus on how young people can contribute to Africa's energy transition. With that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, who is Dr. Rebecca Shali. She's the Deputy Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute, where she works to create widespread public access to high data and insights for mobilizing sustainable development solutions. Before joining WRI, Dr. Rebecca was the Chief of Research at Power for All, a global nonprofit organization advancing universal energy access. Over her tenure, Dr. Rebecca has built a novel energy research dissemination engine that fills critical knowledge gaps for practitioners and decision makers on implementing integrated utility energy services, unlocking agricultural value addition, and creating livelihoods in the African context, receiving multiple awards for this work. Dr. Rebecca earned her PhD and master's from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley, where as a University Chancellor's Fellow, she designed innovative tools for power system planning in emerging markets, and she has over 15 years of experience leading energy and environmental research across Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Hailing from West Indies with roots in Jamaica and Trinidad, Dr. Rebecca now lives in Nairobi with her husband, and together they enjoy exploring Kenya's great outdoors. And she also lectures at Carnegie Mellon University, Africa, where she mentors young students and researchers. Dr. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sharap, for a warm welcome, and allow me to also welcome everyone to this SE for All webinar today. Sharap and the team have asked me to provide a few statistics to just give us context for this discussion on financing SDG 7. Such an important conversation for us to be having as we head into the COP period for Africa. As you all know, despite emitting the lowest levels of greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change, of course, African countries rank as some of the highest on the vulnerability indices and have already begun to feel and deal with the impacts. This year, those of us in Kenya and in East Africa all witnessed a torrential flooding in the region that's happening at the exact same time as the worst 40-year drought on record that is parching Southern Africa. So these extremes are happening at the same time. Allow me to share just 3 statistics that you can write down if you'd like, that I think will provide context for SE for All's conversation today. African countries have fairly robust indices that now document our collective plans and ambitions towards mitigating and adapting this climate reality that we were just talking about. And yes, of course, for these goals to come to life, countries will then need significant and sustained climate finance support. How much support exactly, you might ask? Well, if you pool the estimates of each of these indices together, it will cost around US $2.8 trillion over a 10-year period to implement these NDCs, or on average, about US 250 billion per year. So when you keep hearing this $2.8 trillion number or this 250 billion per year number, that's where it's coming from. This is almost equivalent to Africa's entire annual GDP. And it's likely a conservative estimate, as countries often underestimate their financial needs, especially in relation to adaptation, due to lack of data, or often the subnational and local levels' lack of guidance on assessment methodology, or at the federal level, just the sheer cost of assessment itself. These can all be challenges. But whether there's a large variance around the number or not is actually not the question. The issue is, what's the difference between our best estimates and where we stand today? So far, African governments have committed US 264 billion of domestic public resources, or about 10%, right, of that 2.8 trillion. So the balance, US 2.5 trillion, must come from both domestic and international private sector resources, as well as international public sector resources. And it's this external financial support beyond domestic public sources, that's what we often call the climate finance need or the climate finance gap for Africa. So how much of that need is filled today? It's hard to track climate finance flows, but the total annual climate finance flowing to Africa in, for instance, 2020, both domestically and internationally, was estimated at about US $30 billion. This was mostly coming as ODA from foreign public offers. So when you combine the public sector with the domestic, when you combine the international plus the domestic public sector commitments, we're somewhere at about 12% of that total. So that's number 2, right? Our number statistic number 1, 250 billion per year needed. Figure number 2, we're at about 12% of that. As a frame of reference, that 30 billion per annum that's flowing into Africa represents only about 4% of total international climate flows, international climate finance flows, sorry. So we're almost 20% of the global population, as you all know. We're somewhere around 17 to 18% of the population. We're 4% of the climate finance flows. Just with these 2 numbers alone, a couple of things become clear. 1, obviously, that public finance alone, public funding, will simply not be sufficient, given the magnitudes of investment needed and the real constraints that are placed on public domestic resources in Africa. Yet, as we can see, over 87% of our current climate financing is coming from public sector. So that means, number 2, that we need to do a much better job at mobilizing private sector investment. It's crucial. And in fact, the private sector has significant potential to support the growth of new sustainable economies at scale. Remember that what we're looking at here is not just a public sector infrastructure requirement. What we're looking at is actually investment in entire economies. Just think of all the economies that we could scale in Africa, from landscape restoration to deforestation-free forest products to sustainable food production to electric mobility, green manufacturing, green industrialization, and more. The AFDB estimates that if we just took sustainable food production alone, and if we just looked at sustainable food production only for African cities, forget even about export, that industry alone is in the hundreds of billions per annum. So there's lots of opportunity for private sector to do what they do, which is invest, expecting a return in sustainable industries in Africa, whilst helping to deliver our adaptation and mitigation goals. And so therefore, point number 3, that becomes clear, is that we must urgently unblock whatever are the challenges that are preventing this private sector engagement on climate and sustainability in Africa. But I told you I had 3 numbers to share, so I want to share one last one before I close. And that number is that, well, remember the 30 billion in climate flows that I mentioned that's coming into Africa? That's just a 4% of the total internationally. Well, could you imagine that the lion's share of that 30 billion is going to one single sector? Yes, almost a third, or about $10 billion, is going to renewable energy alone. And renewable energy is a sector with the highest level of private sector engagement. About a third of that 10 billion is coming from the private sector. Far behind is infrastructure, and then further down the road is nature-based sectors. So renewable energy actually represents the largest flows of finance into the continent from the climate sector point of view, and the highest engagement of private sector. And that kind of makes sense, right? You think, okay, well, renewable energy is arguably our most mature sustainability sector in Africa, and energy projects are getting to a more sustainable risk profile. But even with that lion's share of the climate finance, it's still far less than the estimated 133 billion needed per annum to meet our clean energy and universal energy access goals. B, it's still very little private sector engagement, still about 2/3 is public sector. And C, if this is our most mature sector, imagine what it means for all of these other sectors. Especially when you think about the fact that energy is the enabler for these other sectors, right? It enables the productivity that we will need for growing local food or forest product value chains, or for growing industry, or for charging electric mobility, and so on and so forth. The great news is that innovation is indeed happening. 3 key areas of innovation on financing SDG 7 are amongst us. One, we're already beginning to see increased developer and end-use access to available financing through risk guarantee mechanisms, through credit enhancement mechanisms. We ourselves at WRI are working to deliver such solutions, and that's a lot of what we'll talk about today. 2, we're starting to see new instruments to attract investors to the African market, blended public sector, private sector finance structures, debt for nature swaps, green bonds, which can all be substantial channels towards private capital in renewable energy. AFDB is right now the major issue of green bonds in Africa, but countries are diving in. South Africa and Rwanda have explored conservation bonds. Seychelles has explored blue bonds. About 20% of the green bond market in Africa now is channeling towards renewable energy. And finally, we're starting to see new engagement with new, or let me say less traditional private sector actors. Of course, we focus so far on commercial private sector actors and impact investors, but there are many different types of investors that can also be tapped. We can think right away about the Africa pensions. The Africa Pension Fund alone is US 700 billion under assets and management. The sovereign wealth funds, US 16.4 billion in Africa. In fact, actually, assets under management as percentage of GDP for some countries in Africa can be 10%, 40%, even 80% relative to GDP. And the Africa Union launched its 5% agenda, which incentivizes the bringing of about 5% of domestic institutional finance, meaning pension funds and so on, to infrastructure, including energy. So that's it, in 3 numbers, the context for today, and why we so urgently need to identify and enhance the solutions and innovations that are working for energy access in Africa. Africa needs large volumes of climate finance. Very little today is coming from private sector. And even in our most progressed, most mature sectors like renewable energy, we still have a really far way to go. So we need to learn quickly where the challenges are, here in energy access, SDG 7 especially, and we need to figure out how to unlock private sector even more than we're doing today. So let me close there, Sharap. I think today's learnings are not just for the energy access space, but what we'll learn from our speakers today is going to be key for helping to unlock a sustainable, aspirational future of many diverse, robust, sustainable economies across Africa. Thank you to SE4All for convening us, and we hope that you enjoy today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the enlightening remarks, Dr. Rebecca, and for leaving us with those 3 key numbers and facts. And you have mentioned that this sector is like it has heavy public sector involvement in terms of the public financial flows, and with the renewable energy sector, we also have the highest private sector involvement. And you've also touched on innovations, which is fantastic because today we have someone who's in the risk guarantee facility. We will also have hopefully a representative from the African Development Bank.
Only visiting the expo, only for 1 day, it's $20.
Yes, for you to mute. So we also have a policy, we'll have a policy angle and a private sector angle. So you have really touched on all of those. But you know, in our most recent webinar, we had the topic on gender mainstreaming in SDG 7, where we tackled the reality that there are far too few women in leadership roles in the energy sector. So today we are really, really thrilled to have you with us because you're a shining example of breaking that mold. And it is indeed an honor to have you with us today. But before we move on to our panel discussion, I'd like to introduce a valuable tool that perhaps Dr. Rebecca hasn't touched on. It's from the World Resources Institute, where she's from. That is the climate finance calculator that was launched last month. And by using this calculator, you can explore all of what Dr. Rebecca was talking about, how the financial contributions could be distributed among countries based on the historical emissions and economic status. And this will also help to inform negotiations, not only for the new quantified goal, but also critical funds like the Green Climate Fund and the newly established Loss and Damaged Fund. So I encourage everybody to explore this tool, which is absolutely free, by the way, as it facilitates well-informed discussions on climate finance, and the insights it provides will be instrumental in shaping the future negotiations and ensuring that developed and developing countries alike meet their climate finance responsibilities. So we will also circulate all the links and materials that will be mentioned in an email after this webinar. So with that in mind, let's now move on to our panel discussion, where we'll dive deeper into how we can mobilize resources for Africa's energy transition. And we are joined by an exceptional group of panelists, with each one of them bringing a wealth of knowledge and experience to this discussion. And in case you have any questions, like I mentioned earlier, please feel free to use the chat function at any one time, and then we'll address those questions at the end, at the question and answer segment. So without further ado, I will start with Habiba. Habiba Dagash is a senior associate with the Africa Energy Program. She supports RMI's efficient demand stimulation efforts in Nigeria by encouraging the productive use of energy in agriculture to enable rural economic development. Alongside her work, she sits on the Vision Council of the 2023 TED Future Forum. Prior to joining RMI, Habiba was a senior associate at the Boston Consulting Group, where she worked on a range of projects in energy and public sectors. Before that, she completed her PhD in energy systems modeling from Imperial College London, and her research focused on national electricity systems planning for the UK and Nigeria to find ways to deliver the Paris Agreement in those countries. She also advised the UK Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy on its carbon dioxide removal programs, and has co-authored a couple of books on this topic. So Habiba, welcome to the webinar. What a profile you have. We are really excited to have you on today. So the first question I have for you, excuse me, is that with your experience in energy systems modeling, how do you see data-driven approaches to optimize investments? And if you could also pinpoint the high impact opportunities for financing SDG 7 in Nigeria and specifically across the African continent.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. So just diving straight into your question, speaking about how can data-driven approaches support optimizing investment, maybe it's important for me to provide some context on how financing energy access projects has gone to date. I'll use Nigeria as a case study. And I would say in the last decade, we've had, primarily supported by the multilaterals like the World Bank and donor funds and philanthropies, supporting our Rural Electrification Agency to deploy primarily mini grids because a lot of the places that are not connected to the national grid tend to be in rural areas, and the cheapest way to give them electricity is some isolated systems powered by solar. And what we've had is that with almost 200 mini grids being built in the country now, if you look at how they're being used, many of them remain underutilized because there's an affordability issue. If you have let's say 100 kilowatt peak mini grid in a rural community, you find out maybe the peak demand is about 20 kilowatts because the electricity is too expensive. And it's too expensive, not just because people don't have the funds to afford the electricity. It also is because most of their economic activity is not electrified yet. So the demand side of the equation becomes incredibly important. There's been such a focus on financing energy supply interventions that without the demand that allows this infrastructure to be commercially viable, you end up having most of these systems deteriorating over time. A lot of the work that we've been doing, I've been doing with RMI, is on trying to plan supply and demand interventions in tandem, because we see them as being very critical. And where data comes in is we need to understand how rural communities or communities that are currently not connected to any energy infrastructure, how they use energy. We need to understand what are the most profitable activities that need to be electrified, because when we increase demand, electricity demand in a community, we also actually have an effect. It's cheaper to deliver electricity when you have much higher demand. When you have a rural utility putting in infrastructure, if the demand is high, the price at which they need to sell electricity is much cheaper. And that drives a very prosperous cycle where more people can afford energy and they can use it to power a lot of their economic activity. So data has been hugely helpful for us to understand, first of all, the profile of rural consumption, rural energy consumption, and secondly, to understand the type of loads that we need to deploy in a rural community to make energy infrastructure affordable. In the case of Nigeria, many of these loads are agrarian. So what we've been doing is studying really what kind of agricultural activities can readily be powered by solar. And then what are the business models that we can use to get people access to the equipment that can support these agricultural processes. That can be a rice mill, it can be a walk-in cold room for cold storage, a range of appliances and equipment that will support both the demand side and also, by doing that, make energy infrastructure more commercially viable in those communities. Just to take it one step further, looking to the future now, rather than planning the demand stimulation efforts after the energy infrastructure is there, we're using a lot of satellite data to understand where energy and agriculture interventions, integrated interventions, can be built, which is using satellite data to understand regions of good solar availability, high agricultural productivity, good infrastructure linkages, so that the rural entrepreneurs can get access to urban markets where they're going to get the highest where they're going to get the highest margins for their commodities. So a lot of this data that we've been collecting data for about 3-4 years now is to understand, on the commercial side, who is our customer that we need to build a service, that we need to deliver a service or a piece of or a product to. At the same time, to support a lot of the utilities that are deploying energy infrastructure, to plan, to size their equipment for the right communities, to design their projects in a way that the landing price of the electricity is affordable for those communities. Because only then do we get a self-sustaining cycle that private investment can flow into the sector. Right now, it's still dependent on a lot of grants, a lot of subsidized financing, but eventually that will dry up. So it's about creating a business where private capital on its own can generate the needed return to build out some of these energy access projects.
Thank you, Habiba. That was such an interesting analogy, because oftentimes sometimes when people think about energy access, it's just always powering homes, but there's more to it in terms of stimulating the demand, in terms of economic development, and also supporting the customer in what they need, but also marrying the supply and the demand side so that it grows together. And yeah, I mean, we could talk about it all day, but I'll put a pin on that, because I'll come back to you on the question. that we'll briefly dive into ways that governments can receive support to enhance energy access related investments that stimulate economic development. But now I want to turn to Maria Nkonjera, who is a development economist with extensive experience in conducting research and policy analysis across sectors in Southern and East Africa. And over the years, she has supported the work of various think tanks, philanthropies, public institutes, and development finance institutes. In her current capacity, she leads the Hub's work on public finance, providing evidence-based policy support to drive Africa's green transformation. And she has also led and coordinated the delivery of Africa Climate Foundation's program on sustainable finance. Maria is an alumnus of the African Program on Rethinking Development Economics and holds a Master's of Commerce cum laude from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So Maria, welcome to the webinar. We've heard from Habiba how they're trying to create this model that works for both the customer and also provide support from the utility and anchor it with private sector investments, so that it can thrive without subsidies from other segments of the climate finance ecosystem. So from your experience coordinating sustainable finance programs, how can Africa better tap into international climate finance to support its energy transition, especially in countries that have limited finance markets?
Thank you, Sharab, and thank you for allowing me to contribute to this conversation. I'd like to highlight 3 points. First, there are very clear commitments under the Paris Agreement for the provision of international climate finance, right, from diverse sources. So there are existing mechanisms, but it has proven difficult for countries to tap into a financial system that is not fit for purpose. And this, of course, has fueled discussions at the global level around the need to fundamentally transform the financial system. So you have climate finance that is not provided in the form of concessional or grant resources, which exacerbate funds that are up, and Rebecca highlighted this in their opening remarks. And even where climate finance is committed, it's not always delivered as agreed. And we've seen that with the $100 billion climate finance goal. So it's about ensuring finance is provided on fair terms in a manner that also balances the quantum with the quality of finance that is provided. So the continent at large must continue to be active participants in the global reform discussions and hinder our ability to access adequate, predictable, and cost-effective climate finance. And there's a lot of political momentum behind the reform agenda, but I certainly think that there's scope for more youth involvement. And then second is about tapping into the potential of innovative finance mechanisms, avail international climate finance through, for example, carbon market mechanisms, global climate taxes. The Just Energy Transition Partnership, which was spearheaded by South Africa, has also been viewed as a sort of prototype to deliver climate finance that is innovative, that is needs-based and scalable. And the JETP itself was based on a partnership with developed countries, which culminated into an almost $12 billion deal, which is well below what is needed to support South Africa's transition efforts. And we now know that Senegal also reached a similar but smaller deal. And I say all of this with the caveat that although innovative, most of this financing will be delivered as loans in the context of South Africa, at least, which again raises the question about debt concerns and what sort of deal countries are getting to support their energy transition or transformation efforts. And then last, to also put the responsibility on ourselves is to be clear about our financial and technical needs. So we need to build the capacity to develop tangible transition plans that attract climate-friendly investments from our energy sectors. International climate finance is not a matter of charity and shouldn't be viewed as such, but really viewed in the context of Africa's economic transformation ambitions, with the energy sector as a catalyst of the conduit for that. So we need investment plans that can ultimately attract the requisite financing by aligning international finance with our sectoral goals. And sometimes it's a data and information issue because the ambition may be there, but the evidence base that can be used to assess needs, capacity, and resource gaps are often lacking. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Maria, for outlining that. It was short and sweet, but you did pack a punch. And yeah, so just to highlight what you've mentioned, there needs to be clarity on financial and technical needs, but there's laser focus so that we are raising funds for what we already know, what we demand, and what the needs are, and where the gaps are, and where the gaps need to be filled. I will then move on to Obi, and Obi brings a different perspective. Well, Obi joined the African Trade Insurance Agency in June of 2018, initially as a bilingual assistant underwriter for French and English, and he is the underwriter responsible for the renewable energy and power sector at ATI, and is also responsible for the implementation of the regional liquidity support facility, the transparency tool, the Africa Energy Guarantee Facility, and other energy sector initiatives across all of ATI's markets. Prior to joining ATI, Obi worked at Hollard Insurance Zambia Limited for 4 years, where he has risen from graduate trainee to branch manager at the time of his departure. He's a Zambian national who holds a first-class Bachelor of Science degree in Money, Banking, and Financial Environment from the University of Béjaïa in Algeria, as well as various certifications received during his general insurance career. Based at the ATI head office in Nairobi, Kenya, Obi will continue to contribute towards the institution's growing role in providing risk mitigation tools across the African energy sector. So welcome, Obi, to the webinar. I know that...
Thank you.
Thanks, Obi, for joining us. You know, we always hear that doing business in Africa is risky business. And hopefully from your interventions, we can be able to debunk that, because it's not all risky business. We just have to be innovative in our thinking, innovative in how we restructure and structure projects in terms of also financing. So my first question to you is that infrastructure projects in Africa, especially in the energy sector, are often seen as high risk. What steps can be taken to de-risk investments and make them more attractive to both local and international investors?
Sure. Thank you so much for that. And thanks to the two speakers that spoke earlier as well. It was very helpful to hear from them on their different perspectives and their experience. So to your question, because we work on the continent and are active across East, West, and Southern Africa, we have some experience and have seen models at work and initiatives that can help effectively de-risk some of the projects that we hope can advance and address some of the challenges that we see in terms of energy access across the continent. So one way of effectively de-risking projects is simply by improving the policy and regulatory frameworks across African countries. We take it for granted, but in a lot of cases, when you look at the amount of time it would take you to negotiate a contract, the amount of time it would take an investor to get the right permits, the kind of concerns they'll have about the contracts they'll eventually sign, and the political certainty across a number of years, because when you're investing in a project, irrespective of the size, you're probably hoping it can operate for 1 to maybe 3 years. For larger projects, you're looking at 10, 15, or 20 years. So certainty around policy and regulations is extremely important. And we've seen that work. You look at countries such as Kenya, who introduced a feed-in tariff around the 2010s, been very successful in attracting private sector financing. You look at Uganda, who was successful in providing an environment courtesy of a Get Fit program that enabled several projects to close within a very short window. You look at South Africa, that has been very successful with procurement programs, partly because they took the initial steps in making sure that the policy and regulatory frameworks were in place and effective to make projects attractive for investors. So that's one way. The second way is capacity building for local institutions. If you're going to have projects advance, and because they can take a bit of time to develop, it's imperative you have local participation. That local participation can be the investors themselves, can be financiers, can also be a sense of ownership by government entities. And you can only do that effectively by having consistent, thorough, and effective capacity building. I think when you hear about the experiences around mini grids in Nigeria that have been successful, some of the most successful ones are those that are either owned by local investors or involve a certain degree of local participation, because local investors will have a better understanding of the market requirements. They'll be more patient in that they are looking to invest in projects that might not yield a return quite early on. And so their view on whether the investment is successful or not is very long term. The last way comes to the role that we play as a TD and the role that other multilaterals in the private sector can play is that you can then provide effective de-risking instruments. Now, these de-risking instruments can be covering anything from political risk, non-payment risk, the risk of war, civil disturbance, the risk of your contracts being cancelled, the risk that you're being paid but you can't convert your money and repatriate the funds out of the country. And these models have been very successful. As an organization, we've supported projects in Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Malawi over the years, and increasingly doing so across the rest of the continent to ensure that when an investor looks at the contract, looks at the country, by pairing their initial model, their initial enthusiasm to do the deal with effective de-risking instruments from organizations that are rated A, like a PD, AFDB, the World Bank, and the private market, you can then see more and more projects advance and reach financial close. A lot of this has been for bigger projects, but there's room to do that as well for much smaller projects, your C&I, your mini grids, your very small distributed projects, and hopefully by pairing existing financing, effective de-risking, we can get more projects to advance and reach financial close.
Thank you, Obi, for that, and for also highlighting case studies of successful projects, because, you know, oftentimes you're always like, the highlight goes to the projects that flopped big time, and that it makes investors or private sector or anyone looking to invest in the continent to be a bit apprehensive and thinking twice in terms of investing in the continent. But you also mentioned that the policy and regulatory frameworks have to be essential, has to provide an enabling environment for the investments to take place. And I like that you also highlighted that the successful projects are initiatives from the government themselves, because from what you listed, it's a variety of services and products that you offer different countries. You also touched on political risks, and I know it's many countries are going into election period, and in terms as an investor, I would imagine that that is a crucial service to have or a product to have, especially when there's a change in government and when your investments, like you said, they take a long time from when it's like being conceptualized to when it's commercially viable. And so yeah, we did have, I know you've also touched on the commercial and industrial segment. We did have a speaker on energy efficiency, but unfortunately, he wasn't able to attend this webinar. So maybe we can have that for next time. But I want to go back to Habiba because we had put a pin on the question. I would also like to ask you, speaking on governments, how can African governments better support energy projects?
So the channel from here.
Oh, thank you. We have Luke who has just joined. So thanks, Luke.
I joined since the beginning. I don't know why it's your name appearing on my screen when I don't see my name on the screen. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's your name. It's your name. Maybe it's because of the link you sent to me or something.
Probably it's the link, but happy to have you here, Luke.
Okay.
So maybe we can go to Habiba, and then after Habiba, I can introduce you, and then we can get started on your first question.
Thank you, Chair. So on the role of what government can do to support energy projects for economic development. Earlier, I spoke about sort of merging or integrating supply and demand side interventions. I think one thing I want to flag is that for African countries where the state is still heavily involved in investment and development efforts, you find that sector initiatives are always done in silos. So you build out energy projects separate from agriculture projects, separate from industrial projects. And what that does is the lack of coordination between different, whether it's ministries or agencies of government, is that when they're trying to stimulate economic development through a sector, they don't consider how clean energy can be used to even make that project either more affordable or how we can make it more sustainable in the long term. So one big thing the government needs to can do to sort of support energy access projects is to always coordinate between the Energy Ministry or the agency that's responsible for clean energy projects and other development efforts to co-plan them. Because when you consider how energy can enable every other sector, that coordination will naturally mean there will be an increase in the number of energy projects alongside development efforts. I think a second thing that a lot of governments need to do is that maybe speaking from the perspective of Nigeria, where there tends to be a high import barriers, is that if you're trying to nurture a very nascent sector, reducing the amount of customs duties or taxes or import barriers to bringing in the right type of equipment into the country can be a huge driver of growth in that sector. So this could be solar panels, batteries, or solar-powered equipment that can then directly support development or revenue generation activities. A third thing I would mention is that because it's such a new sector, there's still, on the policy side, some technical standards aren't very clear. So what you tend to have is that shoddy equipment gets into the country, and then people give it a try, and then either it doesn't reach the expected lifetime, and that puts people off solar in the long term. So it has a detrimental effect, the absence of that quality control of the technology that's coming into the country. So there's definitely a big part the government has to play in boosting technical standards and ensuring that really they're creating the best enabling environment for these projects to succeed. The very last thing I'll mention is some of these state development banks. They always have huge intervention funds that are targeted at whether it's fuel subsidies or fertilizer subsidies. In the case of Nigeria, some of those funds could be reallocated to energy projects. Right now, they're not being considered. And so the government relies on maybe the World Bank or donors to come and fill that financing gap. But actually, intervention funds that could be more productive rather than supporting consumption, but supporting productivity, reallocating those intervention funds into energy projects.
Thanks for highlighting that, Habiba. From what I hear from you is like the lack of coherence in terms of the agencies and the government institutions will lead to duplication of work, or also maybe a blind spot in terms of how to address the challenges, and that energy sector should not be planned as a silo on its own, but embedded in other segments of the government, like agencies. Yeah, and I would also like to let the panelists know that we do have a question and answer segment, and maybe we might be spent for time, but you can also type an answer for the questions. I have seen this one specifically directed to Habiba. But I would like to turn over to Luke, who works at the AFDB as the Principal Energy Efficiency Specialist and Investment Officer within the Energy Efficiency Division, where he helps the bank's member countries promote large-scale energy efficiency investments to mitigate climate change impacts and address their sector challenges to achieve green growth vision. He is an energy efficiency expert with more than 15 years of professional experience in various EE-related activities, including ESCO, market development, promotion of the Super ESCO business model, project and program design, implementation and evaluation, energy efficiency strategy design and implementation, financial mechanisms and design, and stakeholder engagement. Mr. Tuso holds a master's in sustainable energy systems and management from the University of Flensburg in Germany. Thank you, Luke, for joining us. I don't know if you managed to catch the beginning, the first half segment, but we've talked a lot about investments in the renewable energy sector. But one thing that I have found lacking in most conversation is also the energy efficiency investment side. So we'd like to shift our focus to that. And as you know, the president of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, often likes to refer to energy efficiency as the first fuel. So welcome. And the first question, Luke, is that the Super ESCO model is beginning to gain momentum as a way to scale up investments in this area. Are you able to walk us through how the Super ESCO model works, and if there are any successful examples of its application in African countries?
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for inviting me to join on this discussion. Actually, I was here since the beginning, and that I don't know what happened. Thank you again, and thank you to all the panelists. I would like to start by highlighting let's say, the context in which countries decide, for example, to establish or develop the super ESCO model. And I would like to mention, for example, that the public sector contributes to a very high percentage to the total annual energy consumption in African countries. And if I take the example of Kenya, for example, it is estimated that the public sector consumes about 10% of the total annual energy consumption, electricity consumption in Kenya. And if you take for the case of Kenya, the associated electricity expenses that the government spend per year is approximately 120 million per year. That's a lot of money. Yeah? And this energy usage in the public sector represent a major cost to the government and compete with other economic and other social development programs for the government limited resources. And then we all know the context of, the context in Kenya now with the tax bill that did not pass and the need to really limits the expensive the resources here in the public sector. So that this situation could explain also because of its high amount. It also explains the fact that the public sector entities they really top the list of electricity bills defaulters here in Kenya in the such sense that they owe a lot of money to the electricity company. And as I'm saying, it's not just in Kenya. It's let's say the situation. It's a common situation. It's a situation you see everywhere in Africa. So to address that sort of situation, you'll see that governments now, most governments will initiate energy efficiency initiatives, among which you have the development and establishment of a super ESCO. And basically what the super ESCO is, it is an entity that is set up by the government to identify, develop, implement, and even finance viable energy efficiency projects, mainly in the public sector. So we specifically talking about public buildings, hospitals, schools, municipalities, street lighting, and other public facilities. So what the Super ESCO does is that it will sign a contract with these public institutions, let's say a ministry. It will sign a contract with the ministry promising to reduce the annual energy costs, including all the fees below the present cost. So for example, if the ministry spends, let's say, $1 million US for electricity per year, and it's just an example, right? $1 million of US electricity per year, then the Super ESCO will sign a contract with that ministry and say, okay, I will reduce your electricity consumption to maybe 600,000 US per year by implementing energy efficiency, also renewable energy technologies within the building to reduce the electricity consumption by to 600,000. And then when it signs that contract with the public institution, it will then now contract private ESCOs, energy service companies in the market. It will contract them to implement the required energy efficiency investment that have been identified to reduce the electricity consumption from 1 million to 600,000. And then the investment is paid from the 400,000 of energy savings that have been achieved. So that's how it pays the investment. So basically, just give you an overview of how it works. Now, in terms of experiences, yes, I mean, in Africa here, as I told you, many governments are really showing the interest in developing such super ESCO, such entities, and it has started. I mean, the African Development Bank is providing a technical assistance to Morocco to establish the super ESCO. It has already, the technical assistance has already started. So what we it's a $1 million US grants that the bank provide to the country to like mobilize all the necessary technical resources to accompany an entity that has been designated by the government of the King of Morocco to operate as a super ESCO. So the money is used to mobilize and the technical expertise to accompany them. As you know, this is the first experience. It needs a lot of hand-holding. And also a part of the money is used to conduct audits, energy audit, to form a pipeline of energy efficiency investment in which now the Super ESCO will invest later. So Morocco is the first example. And the bank, the African Development Bank, is also providing the same technical assistance to Kenya, to KPLC. So the technical assistance is undergoing. We are at the stage of mobilizing the technical expertise. So these are, and then in Kenya, it will be, if I can say, the first experience of that kind in Sub-Saharan Africa. In South Africa, there have been initiatives like the programs implemented by the government using the super ESCO model concept. But I mean, they don't claim to be a super ESCO, but they're using the principle, the concept of the super ESCO. So these are the three experience, the three cases that examples that I can give you in Africa. And now that many countries are expressing their interest in developing this model, the African Development Bank have put in place recently, I think that was 2 years ago, a continental program called the Africa Super ESCO Acceleration Program, which aims at supporting up to 3 countries in the first phase, up to 3 countries in establishing and also operationalizing the super ESCOs. So that's an example I can give you on the continent, but outside the continent, there are a lot of examples. ESL in India that has really worked well and has helped India to develop the ESCO market and now also unlock investment in energy efficiency in Belgium, in the Middle East. So there are a lot of examples of countries that have really used the model to sort of, let's say, increase investment in energy efficiency and renewable energy. So let me pause here because of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. And it's so fascinating to hear you talk about the Super ESCO model because it's quite new in terms of the up and coming recent upcoming events in the energy landscape, both within and outside of the continent. And it's good to hear about the case studies from Morocco, from Kenya, about the Super ESCO, and also to hear about energy efficiency projects that the Africa Development Bank is funding. Because more oftentimes when you talk about the energy sector, in my conversations in the youth space, it's very hard to grasp energy efficiency unless you've worked intimately and you understand about energy audits and how to calculate the financing mechanisms in energy efficiency projects. So thanks for highlighting that at the public sector and government levels in terms of the Super ESCO operationalization. Yeah, it's a mouthful to say that word. So I will turn over to Maria, and I know we're running out of time, so we can quickly use 2 minutes to answer the question. So I have one question left for Maria, and then we'll close with Obi. But there's still comments that are trickling in on the Q&A section, so you can answer them while Maria makes her intervention on the question. So Maria, how do you see the intersection of public finance and philanthropy contributing to innovating financing solutions for Africa's clean energy sector, and what strategies could drive the collaboration between these sectors?
Thanks, Sharap. I'll try to keep it brief. But so there's this idea of philanthropic capital being the 4th P in public-private partnerships. And it's really a clear call for partnership, acknowledging that the financing gap is so huge that to mobilize more capital, collaboration is needed across the investment value chain. And I think philanthropy and foundations, along with public finance, can drive catalytic investments, take risks, and innovate in green investments. And philanthropic capital in particular is a unique and flexible source. There are different avenues that philanthropy could play and be leveraged in the energy transition. Right now, we see philanthropic resources are very modest in light of the magnitude of the need. Only a small percentage of philanthropic capital is deployed toward sustainable development. Strategically and tactfully, it could help crowd in additional pools of capital or investment flows in the same way that public finance or development finance institutions do. And I think the value of philanthropic capital in this conversation is that it can be deployed across the spectrum, right? From grants to concessional investments, which means that there are multiple entry points that these endowments can bring. We're seeing big philanthropic organizations slowly move in to fill the venture capital gap in energy transformation, for example. And with that said, I think it's important that philanthropic investments are well targeted in order to generate the greatest benefits. So understanding the local context to support clean energy pathways is very key. So in summary, I'd say that if there are better risk sharing mechanisms with public and philanthropic capital, we can encourage more private investment into the clean energy sector. And this was really emphasized in the keynotes that Rebecca gave around the importance of mobilizing more finance. And then second, I think philanthropic support has the potential to engage in coalitions with governments, other donors, and civil society organizations broadly in pursuit of clean energy development. And we're already seeing this sort of collaboration happening across the board, which is encouraging. Let me stop there. Back to you, Sharab.
Thanks, Maria, for highlighting the fourth P, that is, and also highlighting how philanthropic capital can crowd in other forms of financing. And I will quickly turn over to Obi for the last question, which is also aligned to the question we have on the chat by Mr. Tishome. What are your thoughts on how insurance mechanisms can be better leveraged to support youth and small-scale entrepreneurs working in the renewable energy sector?
Sure. So on this one, I have two contributions to make. The second one will closely tie with what Maria has shared and what other speakers have spoken to. But before I touch on that, the first issue is there'll be an element of customization that is required. When you look at existing products, insurance products and guarantees, a lot of them are well structured for larger projects, both in terms of cost, structure, due diligence required. As a result, if you have a 10 megawatt, 100 megawatt project, it's easier to facilitate the issuance of insurance and guarantee instruments to make that project more bankable for the benefit of investors and lenders. When you look at very small projects, insurance becomes costly, it becomes inflexible, and at times the benefit is not very clear. So some customization to ensure that bespoke products that better suit smaller projects that have been led by the young and by other entrepreneurs to make sure the products are more responsive. That's the first. The second one, and I think Maria explained this very well, around the role of philanthropic funds. You see, when you look at the insurance products being provided, as an insurer, as a guarantor, I'm trying as much as I can to also safeguard my investors, my balance sheet. So I might be selective about the kind of deals I can do because I'm trying to manage as best as possible our own funds. When you then bring in philanthropic funds, you then create what are called blended instruments. And by creating blended instruments around guarantees and insurance, it can elevate our risk appetite. It can allow us to be more innovative, allow us to be more aggressive, and allow us to take on risks that might be very new and more challenging in the first few years as we build up some capacity and portfolios. So those are the two ways: customization through bespoke products, and secondly, creating blended instruments using philanthropic funds. It's already been done, but again, as more funds become available, there should be a role for additional blended instruments to play an effective role in de-risking projects for SMEs, as well as youth-led initiatives.
Thank you for that, Obi, and I hope that also answered Mr. Teshome's question. And hopefully in the future we could have a specific project for the young people who are doing small-scale projects, and that we can have de-risking mechanisms to really stimulate young energy entrepreneurs across the continent. So we have one last question on the chat by Mercy Rose that hasn't been answered, and to the panelists, feel free to take it apart. We have Mercy Rose asking, the current centralized grid infrastructure in most African countries is getting old, and recent trends are supportive of decentralizing power supply. And her question is, how can financing in this space support grid upgrades, possibly to incorporate smart grids as well as grid densification for those living under the grid?
I can try to address it here.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. So I think when you look at the success that has been there in financing, a lot of this success has been with generation projects. So across the entire continent, when you look at the success in South Africa, in East Africa, in West Africa, you'll be looking at new either solar, wind, hydro projects. So you're looking at generation. Now, if you're going to introduce smart grids, you're going to make changes to the grid infrastructure, you're going to attract additional investment. It first of all has to be private sector led, because government financing is simply not available. Even if it is, the government financing has to compete against education, healthcare, and other needs for state budgets. So if you're going to attract private sector financing, you have to find ways to make that possible in transmission infrastructure and in distribution infrastructure. And that's very, very new on the continent. There's been some limited success. So you've got cases such as Umeme in Uganda that has managed the distribution network very well. But in investing in infrastructure lines, in infrastructure projects generally, there's been very little track record across the entire sub-Saharan Africa region. So I think that's where the gap lies, ensuring that there's more private sector funding, and that can be made possible by the use of donor funding, the use of blended instruments, effective use of guarantees. And once the infrastructure, the transmission lines are effective, can accommodate more power on them, it becomes easier to then look at incorporating smart grids. We know that there are initiatives in countries such as Kenya, in Uganda, for transmission lines to be private sector led for the very first time. Hopefully, once those are successful, they can then be replicated across other countries, similar to how generation started off, where you had 1 or 2 IPPs, but now most countries have an IPP. So hopefully that new change in transmission financing from being historically entirely government-led to private sector-led being possible will allow for improved infrastructure, but over time for smart grids to become possible and easily implemented on the continent.
Thanks, Obi. I hope the cocktail of solutions and finding that sweet spot works. It's difficult, but it's definitely possible. And I've seen your comments, John Marvin. Thank you for sharing your opinions on the chat box. But I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our webinar and we're right at the top of the hour. But as we come to the end of today's discussion, and indeed, this is the very final webinar in the Empowering African Youth in Energy series under the SE for All Youth Ambassadors Program 2023 and 2024. And I'd like to take a moment to reflect on what a journey this has been over the course of these sessions. We've explored the critical themes around the energy transition, from innovative finance mechanisms to green skills for the youth workforce to gender mainstreaming SDG 7 and the role that local communities play in the energy transition. And we've heard from experts, young leaders who are truly driving change on the continent. We've connected over shared ambitions to achieve SDG 7 and for the purpose of creating a sustainable energy future for Africa. It has been an inspiring and transformative series with rich insights and tangible takeaways. And together, we've not only addressed challenges, but we've also celebrated the innovative solutions and growing opportunities for our energy sector with the young people in mind. This is only but the beginning of the incredible work ahead. But before we officially wrap up, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to the women in the youth at the Forefront team and the Sustainable Energy for All Communications team for their outstanding efforts in making this series a success. Your dedication behind the scenes, ensuring that everything runs smoothly, allowed for these important conversations to take place and to reach so many people. We truly couldn't have done it without you. And I also want to sincerely thank the panelists and speakers and the participants who've contributed to making this series a success. Your engagement and passion are a testament to the growing momentum for sustainable energy solutions in Africa. While this may be the final webinar in our series, it certainly isn't the end of the journey. The insights we've gained, the connections we've forged over the past few months will continue to fuel our collective efforts towards energy access for all. Let's carry this energy forward and champion youth-driven solutions to advocate for increased investments and to build the partnerships needed to ensure that our energy sector and our transition remain as inclusive, as equitable, and as sustainable as possible. Thank you all for attending. And with that, I officially close this webinar series. Stay inspired, stay connected, and let's keep working towards a brighter, cleaner future for Africa. Thank you and goodbye.